Here, this is a really core moment for our 2 days, and it's really important for this whole process because the process is based on having information so that you can make recommendations. And we're really lucky to have with us today Sam Du Bois from Orebro University, and maybe I'm not saying that correctly, but he will correct me. And he is going to talk about this question of socioeconomic status, which we have begun to touch upon this morning. And he's going to share some of the highlights from the paper that you were sent, where we're going to talk about what is the importance of music in different socioeconomic backgrounds, what are the questions that are posed for admission to our Conservatoire if you are from perhaps a less advantaged socioeconomic background, what are questions related to socioeconomic status, and how is Conservatoire culture changing, or what are the attempts to change Conservatoire culture? So I have asked Sam to say a few words about himself. I'm gonna leave it to you, Sam, to introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I got a bit ahead of myself. So thank you so much for the invite to come and speak. I just want to preface this talk by sort of saying I feel like a bit of a fraud, given that I've been kind of called an expert, but my expertise is really more to do with gender equality in relation to conservatoires and higher music education. I've kind of focused on a comparative approach between Sweden and the UK. As you can hear, I'm English or British, but I live and work in Sweden now. So that's kind of where my expertise is. But obviously, there's a lot of overlap with questions of socioeconomic status as well. So I haven't just focused on gender or just focused on socioeconomic status, but I kind of tend to look at the two in relation to each other. So as Gretchen said, my name is Sam Du Bois. For those of you from France, I know I'm bastardizing the pronunciation, but that's what English people do. And I'm from the School of Music Theatre now at Örebro University in Sweden. And as I say, that's for the people from Malmö, you'll know where that is, but it's basically halfway between Gothenburg and Stockholm in Sweden. So what I wanted to talk about today is, first of all, the question is how unequal is higher music education? And I use the phrase higher music education broadly because in Sweden, for example, we have music high schools. In Germany, you have music high schools or music colleges, I guess, which are higher education institutions, but they're not quite conservatoires. So they're often somewhere between the university and the conservatoire tradition. And in the UK, for example, you often have conservatoires and then music courses taught at universities. So they are kind of different traditions, but I'm grouping them in together. So first of all, how unequal is higher music education? And then secondly, I want to pay attention to what I call material and cultural factors. So when I say material factors, what I mean is economics, the built environment, like physically what is there in the world, but also the question of money. Whereas when I'm talking about cultural factors, it's more about how people learn, how people think, and the sorts of assumptions, the sorts of ideas that people take for granted. I want to talk about the path to higher music education a little bit, because actually when we tend to think about conservatoires as needing to be changed, we tend to think about what can be done in the conservatoires after we've already admitted students. And for me, I mean, the question has to start much earlier. Often by the time people get to conservatoires, they've already chosen their instrument specializations. Obviously, as you know, it takes years and years of dedicated musical training and practice in order to come into higher music education in the first place. So a lot of these changes are stuff that we also kind of need to put pressure on governments to address much earlier so that we can kind of address the inequalities later on. And I wanted to conclude briefly with some things to think about. So hopefully you've all had a chance to glance at the paper. And as I say, it's kind of a bit strange because whilst this is a really important topic and we know that higher education institutions are very unequal in terms of socioeconomic status, or SES, as I've called it, there's not really been that much kind of concrete data published about this. Now, my background is, I'm a sociologist by training. I've played music I played music basically since I took up guitar at 14 very consciously because I wanted to be cool. But essentially, music has been a huge part of my life, but I'm not a trained musician. So I'm trained as a sociologist, and now I work at a higher music education institution. So one of the questions I'm always asking is, well, how do things look at the moment? Like, what, we all know that music education institutions are unequal, but how does that look on paper? Like, how many people come from low income backgrounds compared to high income backgrounds? And the response to that is it's obviously different by country. Gretchen and I were talking in the break about how the UK seems to be addressing unequal socioeconomic inequalities in conservatoires to a much larger extent than other countries. And I think that is true, but that's also because historically the UK has been a much more unequal society as well. The UK also, I mean, I guess like other countries like France and the Netherlands, for example, has a colonial history that also impacts on marginalized groups in a society in a way that it maybe doesn't in other countries, but I'll come back to that. So the answer is it's different by country. The exact figures are very hard to find on how many people of different socioeconomic groups actually attend different institutions. And the reason for this is partly because how we measure socioeconomic inequalities, how we measure class is often different by different countries as well. So some people, often socioeconomic indicators or socioeconomic classifications or status is often a combination of parents' occupation, your occupation as an individual, or the job you do, the income that you have, and education levels and the education levels of your parents. So if you kind of take those 5 factors into consideration, it becomes quite complicated. So as I say, socioeconomic status is defined differently in terms of different countries and different histories' impact on it. As I understand, you were kind of talking about the fact that you had different perspectives in terms of how socioeconomic status looks at your institutions. And given that so many of you are from different countries, that's not surprising, because how class looks in different countries is often slightly different. It's not always, but it's often slightly different in different countries. So as I say, that I find it really frustrating that there's not exact figures that you can go to and you can find how many people from deprived backgrounds or low socioeconomic status backgrounds actually attend conservatoires. But as I point out in the paper, only 6% of applications, and this is applications, these are not the people that are admitted, in the UK, or in Britain, sorry, I should say, come from the lowest and most deprived backgrounds. Now they measure this through postcode, so what the area code of the students who apply. So that's how they look at deprivation in something that's called a polar measure, which basically measures where people come from and the likelihood, the chances that they come from a low income background. Christina Scharf has also indicated that about 25% of those attending traditional HMEIs, higher music education institutions in Britain, come from fee-paying private schools, but only 7% of the whole population attends private schools in the UK. So again, this is not to say that conservatoires in the UK are quantitatively entirely dominated by the least deprived groups, or the groups with the most money, but there is a clear distinction in terms of you are more likely to be accepted and to apply for a higher education institution if you come from a higher income background in the UK. Now, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on whether the situation is similar in your own countries, because my partner is German, but I don't read German, so I wasn't able to find comparable statistics in the German context or the French context. But I could not find these statistics in the Swedish context either, which is very frustrating. So as I say, figures are very hard to find, but at the same time, higher education has become more diverse generally in terms of socioeconomic status. We see this, we see the number of students that are being admitted generally to universities, to conservatoires, has increased over time. Looking at this specifically in the UK, you see a massive increase after the removal of the limit on tuition fees. Now, why is this? Well, it's also because universities are actively encouraged to recruit more students to become economically sustainable. So you have this idea that education institutions generally are becoming more democratic, but the proportion of students from lower income versus higher income backgrounds is actually remaining quite stable. So whilst you have more students from lower income backgrounds, you are essentially seeing the proportions remaining quite stable over time. So yes, we do have more diverse institutions, but in terms of the division, they're not that diverse. The other thing to point out is there are obviously differences in terms of higher music education institutions here. So it's not that all conservatoires, it's not that all higher music education institutions are middle class or working class. It's also depending on what courses they offer. Some are much more likely to be to attract students from more economically deprived backgrounds, and some are more likely to attract students from less economically deprived backgrounds. So what you have here is a difference in institutions. And one of the things that I point out in the paper is those courses which offer, those institutions which offer kind of music technology and music production courses tend to attract higher numbers of students from lower socioeconomic groups to those courses. So I think that this is interesting in terms of thinking about the types of courses that music education institutions offer also are a way of recruiting students from different backgrounds. So as I say, I'm just going from the UK context, or the British context, I should say. And we know from this that lower socioeconomic students are more likely to prioritize generally stable careers and not the arts. As we all know, careers in the arts are very unstable. There's a lot of competition. The kind of stability of getting a job in the performing arts, in the musical arts, it's a very unstable occupation. And so this also impacts on students' decisions on what to study. So one of the things that affects this is obviously economic factors. If you come from a background where you do not have security, you are more likely to choose a career where you know that A, you can earn money to provide for your future security, and B, that you are likely to have a job at the end of it. So this is a divide that we see regardless of the country, that the people from more privileged backgrounds tend to choose the arts and the humanities in greater numbers. There is also the problem of invisible discrimination, what is often referred to as implicit bias. So this is not necessarily at the conservatoires, but this is obviously at conservatoires and higher music education institutions. So the bias can manifest itself in terms of the repertoires we choose, the types of attitude that we think are important, and as well, the way we judge students, from everything from their looks to the way they kind of behave in a certain setting. So this is a kind of, I will come back to this idea, but it's this idea of what Pierre Bourdieu has called habitus. And this is kind of a key concept in terms of the way in which socioeconomic status has been studied in relation to higher music education. The other problem is students are often disadvantaged earlier on in secondary school, high school, in that teachers often have a much more negative attitude to students from, or pupils from, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, this implicit bias is not just something that's at higher music education institutions, it's also something that happens much earlier that leads to lower grade attainment at schools. So if you don't get the grades, if you don't get the option to study music, for example, at school, then you're less likely to go and study it later on. And then there, as I say, there is this question of what's been referred to as habitus. Now, habitus is just a way of thinking about the world. So it's a concept that was defined by a French sociologist. Well, actually, it's a concept that goes back to the Greeks, but it's a concept from a sociological perspective that was kind of formalized and really kind of brought to the fore in the 1970s. And this is about how we see the world, and how we see the world is kind of different. How we judge what is good, what is bad, what is valuable, what is invaluable, is something we learn through socialization. We learn it through our parents, we learn it through interaction with our friends, we learn it through education institutions. So this obviously has a huge impact. The types of music your friends listen to, the types of music your parents listen to, will have a huge impact in terms of how much you value certain types of instrument playing, certain types of musical activities. It's not necessarily the institutions themselves in terms of the numbers of people from low and high socioeconomic backgrounds, which are always unequal, but the traditions definitely are. So if we think about the kind of Euroclassical tradition, which is obviously the tradition on which modern conservatoires are kind of founded, there is this assumption that those of you who are familiar with this idea of absolute music, the idea that music shouldn't have any relationship to society, for example, is a tradition that kind of finds its roots in the late 17, early 1800s, and is still something that lives on today. What I'm saying is, if you take that view of music, that music in the Euroclassical tradition is valuable because it's separation from modern day life, and you've learned that that's something that's important, then if you take that to a conservatoire with you, then you kind of still have that tradition, you still have that implicit value. Now, Bourdieu often argued that working class people don't think about culture in the same way as middle class people. And I mean, I won't go too much into this, but I'm happy to take questions on this. I have some issues with regards to the way that Bourdieu kind of talks about music and its relationship to class. But the argument is the types of activities we value, the way we behave, the opportunities, the possibilities that we see as open to us are shaped by socialization. But it's not just culture. So often people point to these cultural arguments, but also economic factors play a huge role in terms of time and resources to actually play music. Now, again, this is before and after people get to higher music education institutions. So economic factors impact on the time you can spend playing an instrument. If you work a job, if you work a second job, for example, that will inevitably impact on how much time you can spend rehearsing, how much time you can spend practicing. Also, if your parents, for example, work a second job, or if they work multiple jobs, then your parents are not available to take you to rehearsal. Your parents are not able to invest as much time into your musical development as a student where they both work a 9-to-5 job, or where one parent doesn't work, for example, and is financially stable. So again, parents' career, parents' occupation impact on how likely it is that young pupils, young people that play music, it impacts on how likely they are to access music services as well, and how much time they can dedicate to it. Then you have obviously the impact of music tuition. And music tuition is, sorry, I've just read to slow down a bit. My apologies. So you also have, like I say, music tuition, and music tuition is very expensive in the UK. It is about £40 an hour in London, and about £30 an hour outside of London. We have municipal art schools called Kulturschulen here in Sweden, where I forget the cap, but I think, oh my God, I've written this down. But anyway, it is much lower than it is in the UK. Musikhochschulen in Germany, again, I think is relatively expensive in comparison to the municipal art schools in Sweden. So these things make a huge impact in terms of who is able to play music and create music, and therefore who gets accepted. One of the things that research shows is that parents' interests in music are the biggest motivator as to whether or not a child starts playing an instrument or not. And this is obviously something that conservatoires, higher music education students higher music education institutions need to bear in mind. So parents' music interests often are a best predictor of whether or not a child starts learning instrument or not. So obviously, if you want to encourage children to start playing instruments to a level where they will come into the conservatoires, you need to essentially start with the parents. Now, that's something that governments need to do, and we need to put pressure on governments to actually increase access to music education outside of conservatoires. As I say, as I write in the paper, intervention is also needed before as well as after admission. So it's not enough to simply think about, well, what do we do once we've got the students? And obviously maintaining and being respectful of the fact that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have a different experience is important. It's really important to be attentive to the fact that we all have implicit biases, and institutions are built on certain traditions that exclude particular groups of people. So it's important to be aware of those traditions. But it's also, we need to think about how we structure the admissions process, how we think about the audition process in order to come into higher music education institutions. So we need to think about how we work with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, what types of music are they more likely to be making, and also to be aware of these kind of biases when it comes to the audition process. Now, this is something in relation to gender, there has been a lot of research about, but there is less research when it comes to socioeconomic status. As I said before, investment in free, high quality music programs are also really important. There are various studies from the UK that have shown that when you invest in free music programs, that there is an increase of interest from people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And as I say, this issue of repertoire. So one of the things that sociologists have often shown is that there is a link between the type of music that people like, the type of music they listen to, the type of instruments they play, and socioeconomic status. Now, if we have admissions auditions that are based on standard repertoires that a lot of the population are not familiar with, then it automatically excludes people who are not familiar with those repertoires, with those songs or with those pieces of music. So there is a way of thinking about how we can do auditions differently in order to recruit from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So what is being done at the moment? Well, in the UK, we have what's called widening participation. This is essentially trying to get students who would not traditionally go to universities or higher education institutions into those institutions. There have been attempts to encourage newer, less kind of traditional music courses. Again, this is an issue about student recruitment. So there are some universities that offer courses in hip hop, electronic dance music, music production and songwriting, for example, and that has kind of seen an increase in students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds coming and studying music at universities. There are also extracurricular training programs. And again, as people that work in conservatoires or people that work in HMEIs, it's something that we can offer as well. So we can work with community engagement to actually offer extracurricular music activities as part of our kind of, what is it called? Our kind of social responsibility. There's also the issue of role models. Now, as I say, I work mostly with perspectives on gender equality, and the question of role models is perhaps more obvious in relation to gender, but it's also a question about who universities and conservatoires recruit to teach. The argument is if a student doesn't see themselves reflected, or if a student doesn't see themselves represented in the staff at an institution, then they are much less likely to feel at home in that institution. So as I say, this is about who we recruit to various institutions, and it's a question about which repertoires we encourage students to play, and specifically which instruments. And the final point is socioeconomic status is not a category that is just by itself. So in Sweden, if you are part of an ethnic minority, you are more likely to come from a disadvantaged background. If you are a single parent, for example, more likely to be a woman, you are less likely to come, you are more likely to be economically deprived because you have to essentially pay for yourself and the child. So again, these things like race, ethnicity, gender, geography, where you live, are likely to impact on your socioeconomic status as well. And as I say, this can impact on the types of instruments you play. If you come from a certain region or a certain ethnic group, you are more likely to play a particular instrument that might not be represented in what the higher education institution teaches. So again, these can all contribute to the fact that we don't have very diverse environments. I think I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. And I have some questions, but I understand that we have some questions at first from the audience, and then, yeah, we can go on to take a discussion from there.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much, Sam. I think that this was really very, very inspiring. We see that a lot of factors come into play here. We could see them as obstacles. We could see that there are issues around information. We don't necessarily have enough information about what the situations are, that the situations are quite varied in the different countries. And we saw actually this morning in the exercises that you had very different perspectives, even from similar institutions. And I think that it was very enlightening to hear about both cultural obstacles and material obstacles to entrance into the higher music education sphere from those in socioeconomically lesser situations. And we also see that this is a broad concept. It's not just, okay, blanket, okay, you're poor, but you may be from a different ethnic group, you may be from a different race or gender, that there are all these factors that come into play here. So we have now some time for questions and answers with Sam. So I would like to ask if any of you has a burning question, and I will come over, or Esther will come over with the microphone. And please introduce yourself to Sam and say where you were coming from and ask your question.
Yes. Hello, Sam. Thank you for your report. Yeah, it's interesting, and so yeah, it's great to have the presentation also. My name is Alexandra. I'm from Kharkiv. So my question is, it's at this point, rethinking music theory requirements. Could you please clarify what do you mean exactly with it? So I just, yeah, I can't understand completely.
Yes, so we have sight reading requirements, for example. So the sight reading requirements in terms of music theory will often be given to students regardless of the music tradition that they are studying. So we have, for example, students that study jazz and rock that are still expected to sight read notation to a high level when they come in. Now, if you are familiar with that tradition, if you are familiar with having been able to sight read from when you're very young, you have much more of an advantage of coming into a conservatoire. Now, that doesn't necessarily, and I know this is a contentious issue. This is a debated issue because conservatoires have to maintain the balance between preserving certain musical traditions and then being more open and inclusive. So I really meant that we have sight reading requirements, we have listening requirements for students that come into universities, and these principles are based on an understanding of music that is related to the Euroclassical tradition. Now, obviously, the ability to improvise when you're sight reading is part of jazz history, but much more emphasis is placed on kind of oral traditions and aural traditions, like listening in terms of folk music, in terms of popular music, but we still require students to be able to sight read to a high degree. Again, their playing might actually compensate for sight reading, but if they can't do both, then that becomes a problem, and that's obviously exclusion. That excludes some students that had not had the opportunity to learn to read music from a very early age. So that's what I meant by that.
Thank you. Do we have additional questions? And this also, this answer touches upon the subject of inclusion and exclusion, which we will be talking about later. Yes.
Hello, Sam. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's Anna from Croatia. And I was really interested when you were talking about role models in higher music education institutions. So my question would be, since you did the research and you presented your paper on student population at higher music education institutions, do you know for research, or maybe you plan to do research related to teachers at higher music education institutions and their socio-economic status or background, or how to say it?
Yes, that's a really great question. So I can say that, yes, we are planning to do research on it, but I am not aware of, again, I think there's been a lot of qualitative research that's been done on this, but not so much in terms of quantitative. As a sociologist, I tend to do both. I want to know how many and what are the experiences of the majority of those teachers. So I have not actually seen a lot in terms of teachers that come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, but I do know that there is research which shows that, for example, students at conservatoires are more likely to become teachers at the conservatoires. So if the students come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, then inevitably they're more likely to go on to teach at those institutions as well. As I say, this is very different in terms of the institution and the country. Personally, I think Sweden is a lot more equal than I think Sweden is a lot more equal than the UK. And I mean, that's owing to a different political tradition. So I can say, just from personal experience, yes, it probably is more likely the case that in a country like Sweden, you have a more diverse, socioeconomically diverse teaching staff. At an institution like mine, I don't think that's the case in Stockholm. The Royal Stockholm Academy of Music, for example. But no, so sorry, I'm rambling. The answer is no, there's not a lot of research on it that I've seen. Yes, we are planning to do some research, but in terms of role models, it's partly about the staff, but it's also about which musical figures we tend to use when we're teaching music. So when we're doing music theory, which pieces do we give to people, and what are the backgrounds of the composers as well? Obviously, if we're kind of picking the classical canonical composers, they tend to come from a specific background. If we're picking specific jazz musicians, and this is why in relation to gender, I think it's really important, because people often, especially in jazz canons, they tend to go to the instrumentalists first. So the instrumentalists who, because of canonical jazz histories, are often exclusively kind of men, even though there are many women jazz instrumentalists, you know, Mary Lou Williams, Nina Simone, to name just a few. So I think that it's not just about the teachers, it's also about, again, the repertoires and the types of musicians that we use as examples when we are teaching students. And that contributes to whether or not a student feels that they are included or excluded.
Thank you. Can I ask, yes, we have a question from Dublin here. Anya?
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name's Anya, and as Gretchen just said, I'm from Dublin. And I'm wondering, when you were doing your research for this paper, did you come across any students with disabilities as well, whose family might not have the money for their higher education or for the auditions because they've already invested so much into different facilities within the home, or even just to try and get them the education they need, for example, in technology? I myself am visually impaired, so I haven't come across many students myself, but I was just wondering if that came up in the research as well.
No, and thank you very much. It's a really great question. Like I say, I'm not an expert in this field in as much as I know everything that there is to know about it. I do know that there are some researchers, specifically Andrea de Lorenzo Tilbury, I think she was at Malmö, who's looking into she's basically applying a disability studies framework. So disability studies is a specific field of sociology as well. And it's talking about how people are marginalized or disabled by society rather than it being an individual disability. Now, I know that she's looking at music education classrooms in primary schools and secondary schools, I think, but I haven't seen anything in conservatoires. But it is a really good point as well, because obviously when this is what I was trying to emphasize at the final bit, if you are someone who has to spend a lot of money in order to essentially access equipment, for example, then of course you're not going to have the economic resources and possibly not even the time to devote to music practice. So that's why these initiatives need to be supported by conservatoires, but they also need to come from outside, and they need to come from governments primarily, and for governments to realize that this is not just a question of socioeconomic status or disability or gender or ethnicity, for example, but actually that they intersect in different ways. So as I say, I haven't come across that research, but I do know it's an area in which people are starting to develop research in relation to music education. And it's long overdue.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking here to see if Ankna.
Hi, Sam. I'm Ankna. I currently live in Glasgow. It was just, you did mention that you don't have the answers to everything, because if you did, we wouldn't be having this assembly. But my question was regarding, you touched upon it, about the governments and how conservatoires tackle these issues. What is the intention? Because sometimes, because there is such lack of funding in the creative arts sector and the education sector, that this becomes more of a tick box activity, that in order to attract that particular funding, we need to show that we have X number of, what's the diverse population and how many countries we've got students from and staff from as well. So just maybe a couple of thoughts that you had. Thanks.
As I say, I'm an academic, so I'm very bad at providing answers to these questions. I'm more kind of diagnosing the problem, but I agree it's a huge problem. And I also am fully supportive of that criticism that it becomes a box ticking exercise. I know that in Britain, one of the things that has been really kind of scary actually to watch is the way in which British citizenship values of British citizenship has found its way into music education as well. So there has been a concerted attempt by the government to basically give funding and allocate funding on the basis of which composers musicians are playing, as well as to certain traditions, usually classical music traditions, and that's not a surprise. But in terms of what we can do about it, I actually think that the Swedish model in many respects is quite good, because it recognizes a plurality or a diversity of different aesthetic traditions. But honestly, I really don't have the answer to that. I would actually be interested to hear your thoughts on it, because you're one of the people that works in these institutions. Am I allowed to ask a question back?
It's always nice to do that.
Yeah.
To deflect the question. No, I completely agree. And I think this is something that is on my mind as well. And I was curious to see what your thoughts were, because it's just frustrating to be on various diverse boards or like working groups, just because I'm a woman of color, to kind of build up that, you know, for example, taking pictures of your students of color or disabled students for the prospectus to show that there is, you know, visibility. But in the real kind of state of things, there isn't support. And of course, it comes to this whole understanding, or lack of understanding, should I say, about the needs and the requirements of these students that come from various backgrounds, including socioeconomic backgrounds. But yes, I was, like yourself, I don't have concrete answers. And not just I have only criticisms, but I think it's important to talk about these issues as well, and not just talk about surface level issues. But yes, no, I will not take more time, because I'm not supposed to be speaking in this conference, sorry.
Can I just say, so I think one of the things that I did think about when addressing this presentation is we take for granted that participation in higher music education should be open to everyone. Of course it should be, but the question of why it's actually important, I think, is something that we tend to neglect. And I think that question of why this is important is something that I think academics, practitioners can make the case more forcefully for. And as I say, I have no illusions about the UK government's intentions. I think that they are essentially engaging in a box ticking exercise a lot of the time. I think that you can be strategic about that and still be critical of it, of course, but the question of why is it important to actually encourage people from different backgrounds is actually a really fundamental question that we often don't address. And that question of why is, of course, an ethical question, but I think it's also a question in terms of developing traditions. The whole debate around why conservatoires exist are partly to conserve, but also partly to develop artistic merit. And if you have similar students coming through year on year, and you're not having that kind of diversity represented in the music, then it's essentially, it's not a living tradition. And I think that question as to why is something you can make, we all need to be better at making a case for, not to the government, but to publics, I think, in terms of it's not just an ethical question, but it's also an artistic question. That's a very vague response.
Thank you. Does this inspire further questions from our group? Aneta from Graz.
Hello, Sam. I will give now a maybe very strange question. Let's imagine the government will give us all the money we have. We will open all the conservatoires and all the music schools for free. We will let students choose their own subjects, their own teachers. It will be then the point everybody will be happy and we all become a better musicians and better teachers. That's the main question. It will change our situation, and what will be the result?
Yeah, that is a really great question, because I can say personally, I'm not in favor of letting students decide the curriculum. I think students should have a say as a democratic right. I think students should have a democratic say in how they are taught, but this assumption that students know best is also one of the ways in which the UK government especially, and other governments, are also closing down music programs. So they say, if you don't attract enough students, then you should be closed down because you're not economically effective. I do think that there is a role to be played for teachers and universities deciding what traditions students should learn. I actually don't think that students should be allowed to do exactly whatever they want to do. I think, like I say, it's a democratic right, especially in Sweden, that students are able to have a say in what they are taught and how they are taught, but it's not that the students decide. I think the result, in answer to your question, would probably not be good. And I do think it's important because essentially students do lots of things that they don't want to, but in the long term, they realize that it's beneficial for their development. I mean, I can give various examples from having taught sociology. Students hate methods. Students hate talking about methods. Students hate music theory, often at conservatoires. But I think it is very important, but there are different ways of teaching music theory. So in terms of the results, I actually, like I say, I don't think it would be good in terms of artistic development. I don't think it would be good in terms of students' development. But I do think responding to the fact that there are certain students that have a wider variety of music tastes and music interests is actually something which is important. So I'm actually not advocating that we get rid of classical music, for example, or that we get rid of chamber music programs, or just because we don't have enough students. I actually think it's really important to make a case for this is important for conserving a tradition, but we need to also be critical of how we teach those traditions. So as I say, if we got all of the money, which obviously would never happen, but if we did get all the money, then I still think that teachers in collaboration with students can come up with a form of curriculum that is a bit less top down, less teachers just deciding, and a bit less kind of bottom up, just students as consumers, because I think that is a real problem as well.
Thank you, and we have time now for one final question. Here? Constanza.
Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And the question is now going in another direction, because I think the direction Annette gave us is very interesting. And your answer was very, very good, because it has in account everything we have to think about, and it's not an easy answer to this. My question is a bit going in another direction. You talked about the British students at British Conservatoires in Austria, for instance, and I know it's the same case in the other countries here. We have a very diverse community of students who come from very different countries. So we are very international, but are we socio-economically spoken diverse, or are all those international students coming from the same socio-economic backgrounds? Do you have figures on that?
No, I don't actually. And as I say, I can't read German, so I think some of you would be much better placed to find this information in the countries in which you're working than I will. I can say that students who come from overseas backgrounds in Sweden is very, very low. I mean, generally for the whole of Sweden, it's actually quite low. I don't have data on that. In terms of the UK, the UK often give figures on race and ethnicity split out by socioeconomic class. So that I wanted to get data on the number of Black British students, for example, Asian British students or British Asian students that were, and these categories are terrible, but they're the only way the government collects information. So I wanted to get that information on how many of these ethnic minority groups, Black and ethnic minority groups, came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they do not provide that data on the individual level. So they either have race and ethnicity as a classification or socioeconomic class. And that's a real problem when it comes to doing this more complex sociological analysis, because unless you have the data at the individual level, you don't know the individual characteristics, the individual attributes of that particular person. So again, it's another long answer. I am not aware of any data that exists on that. I would be very surprised, given GDPR. Now, if that is easier to do, it requires ethical approval in order to get that data on an individual level. And even then you have to be very careful with how you get it. So I don't know if that data exists. I haven't come across it, but I suspect that your suspicion is correct, that it's mostly privileged, economically privileged students from diverse ethnic backgrounds that are coming to, was it Graz or was it Mannheim?
Graz.
Graz, okay. Interestingly, my partner actually studied in Graz, but she lived in Mannheim. She was born there, so that's interesting for me at least. Yeah, so as I say, there's no data that I've come across.
So I would just really like to thank Sam. I think that you've opened a lot of avenues that we can pursue here. And I take away a couple of things. One is that we really need to build awareness in our institutions that these are questions that need to be addressed, and that we may just have put under the rug, or they haven't even come into our vision, and that we also need to find a balance between maintaining and conserving great classical traditions that we know exist, but also opening our institutions to the many new strands that are coming up, and in which it's possible that there could be many participants from different socioeconomic backgrounds. But I also take it that this is a garden that needs to be watered. And you are all here, and you can start digging in this garden, and you can start watering it and seeing what you find, because we see that there's a lot of information that's lacking, and some of the key questions here really open doors. And so I just want to thank you so much, Sam, for this really inspiring presentation and for opening these doors and opening the garden to us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the invite.
So we are, thank you so much, Sam. We are coming to another portion of our, I'm getting lost on my piece of paper. Oh my gosh. Okay, we are going to have an opportunity to speak our language. If you are not an English speaker, you will be very happy. And now we are going to ask the question, what we just heard, what does that signify? What does that suggest for our institutions? And we could also address these questions of diversity and socioeconomic status. I know you've talked about it a little bit this morning. And more concretely, what does this suggest in terms of actions that might take place in your institution? So we are going to break out into, I don't know, I need to make I'm going to pass it on to Esther. She's the expert on the breakout here.
Organization. I said my favorite instrument is project management, right? So, so we have the German-speaking group that will go with Constanze. So that's both Graz and Mannheim. San Sebastian will be led by Jesus. We have Sweden that goes with Lasse, and Croatia with Anna, and Caroline will take the Polish. But what is important to know is that Rome, people from Rome, will go with Megan, so Dublin and Rome will be mixed, and Kharkiv will go with Croatia, so with Zagreb together. And I'll take care of the Zoom group this time. So, yeah, and Poland, of course, will be with Carolina. I don't know if I mentioned that. All right, and we will meet together in those language groups until lunchtime. And lunchtime is in about half an hour, and we'll see you back after the break. But first, don't forget to discuss before you run and to get some food.